Okay, so this is the fourth part of a series called Heroku Architecture Credential by Example. And as a reminder, the first thing is, if you're looking for the other videos or the agenda, look on Medium with the title Heroku Architecture Credential by Example. Okay, so part three, we covered the core concepts. So we took the example we did in part two, and then we just dived in and explored some concepts. And not very imaginative, but part four is actually some more core concepts. We'll do a little bit more coding to illustrate these concepts, but there's still some just more core concepts. Things like environment, logging, resources. We're going to talk about releases again, metrics, and alerting. Okay, so let's close this down and let's open up the project. Make this bigger. Okay, and Heroku Cert. Okay, so again, I'm actually creating a series of branches. So branch. Basically, the branches, I'm doing this so I can like checkpoint my code. You're probably just working off a master branch. So I just created a new branch off of my started example before called More Core. And the first topic we're going to talk about is environment. So the idea is we can set up environment variables that we can use to control how the app runs in different environments. So in this case, we're going to create an environment variable called development that we can use to flag whether or not some console output happens. So I'll just do it by example, and then we'll explain some more as we go. First thing we need to do is change our code. So let me get into the code real quick. And I'm going to go to server. Okay, so here, I mean, again, this is a simple hello world example, but I'm going to go ahead and add in on our response. I'm going to add in let me get it done first. Okay, I'm going to add in a constant here. Call it hello, right? And equals world. I'm going to use it down here by just getting rid of the world here. Okay, so it just functionally didn't change anything. It's just now I'm defining hello in a variable, and then I'm going to do a console if process environment development. Okay, so basically if this environment variable exists, I'm going to console log hello. And when linter complains, I'm going to put a comment there. Okay, so all this code's doing is saying if there's an environment variable called development, when this API gets hit, just dump out the word hello, or dump out the value of the hello, which was going to be world. So again, not super meaningful, but sometimes you do this where you may have a flag like a development flag that you can turn off and on to show more debugging. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this. Okay, so now we've updated our code to use it. The next thing we need to do is how do we, in local development, how do we set that environment variable without having to do it through, some like command lines and stuff like that before we run our code. So the trick here is, let me get out of this. The Heroku's got a thing where you can create a file called .env. So I'm going to say .env, okay? And in here, I'm going to type in the environment variable. So development equals true, okay? So there's a new file called .environment. Now, one thing you want to do is you don't want to ever check in this environment file to your repository because it's really meant to be used in whatever environment you're running in, right? So in this case, I need to change my git ignore and add in .env. Okay. Okay, so I've got my get ignore change. I have this new environment file. Now, if I just run my normal run right here, it's not, nothing, right now, nothing is going to use that environment file. So if I just run it, I'm never going to see the console log output. So one of the tools that Heroku provides is called, when you're running locally, you can run a command called Heroku Local. So if you run that, it'll actually read in the environment file beforehand, and then it'll start your code, and then you have the environment variables set. Now, let me do this. I'm gonna do this in a series of steps. So the first step is, let me go ahead and remind myself how to build this thing. So build is just build. So if I just do yarn build, no, not yarn. If I do npm run build, okay, and that just built my project, right? And if I try, let's do this. Let's run Heroku. Normally I would do npm run start, right? And npm, gosh, I'm having a hard time this morning. Start, okay, and I'm running. And if I just for illustrative purposes, if I go to localhost 3000, okay, my hello world's there, but notice no console output. That's because the environment variable is not set. So the question is, how do I do this? If I actually type another command, if I type in Heroku Local, which is a new command for us, okay, let's see what happens. So now you notice something happened here. There's, first of all, it found an environment file, this command, and it actually set the key value, the environment variables. And this time it provided a port variable, so my port actually runs on 5000. My app runs on 5000 instead. So let's try this. What happens if I go to localhost 5000? Okay, there's my hello world, and look at that. You see now you have this output. That's because this Heroku Local command read the environment file, set the environment variables up, then started the app up, right? So that is how we, now the problem we have is a couple things. One is, I find it annoying that it's running on 5000. So let's do this. I'm gonna, just for cleanliness, source, I don't like the fact that my code was defaulting to 3000, and I'm gonna run it on 5000 just because it bothers me that it didn't, now it's running on 5000 by default. Okay, so what was really happening though is that the Heroku local command was supplying the port variable, by the way. That's why it was going to 5000. So I'm just being explicit here. Okay, one problem we have here, if you look at our package JSON, if you look at how we were doing our our local development with the watch command, it was running this nodemon, basically running the output file directly. It wasn't running this Heroku local thing, which means if I try to use this watch command, it's not going to use the environment variables. So I'm kind of sort of in trouble here, right? Where I have the new environment variables that are going to be required by my app, but I have my current watch command doesn't support it. So it turns out that we can fix this by just changing this watch node here. I'm going to see if I can get this right on the first pass. So I can say watch node, nodemon execute, and then I want to execute a command, and I want to type in Heroku local. I'm going to end that. Now there's apparently one other trick here. Signal. I'll explain it once I type it. Okay. So basically, I'm changing my watch, my nodemon, which is basically what watches for file changes and reloads it. Instead of running the node application directly, it's executing the Heroku local command, right? And the way it restarts the Heroku thing is by sending a sigterm signal. And that's important because that's how Heroku operates, even on when it's running in the cloud, is that the way you terminate Heroku apps is you send sigterms, which is a type of signal. So that's what this command is basically doing, saying this is telling it how to run it and how to restart it. So if I got this right, which is probably a 50-50 thing, if I type a npm run watch, right, what should happen now is it will run Heroku Local instead of just running the node code directly. And then as I make live changes, so it's listing on port 5000. So let's see if this actually is working. Okay, that's good. Okay, and there's my log, right? And if I was to go in here, because I have to go put up a new window, cd docs, cd Heroku cert, and if I go into my editor and I change my, let's see, if I go to my server and if I put in hello world 2, wherever that is, here, there. If I save that, it should have reloaded, so I'm just watching it reload right there, I think I saw it. And if I see this, it should say hello world 2, right? So this is working, and then the environment variables now should say, if I look at my output, which is here, it says world 2. Okay, so I was able to switch out my local development to use Heroku Local, even with the watch command. Okay, let me get rid of that world 2, because I don't really want that in my repository. Okay, and then reloaded, and then it's back to world. Okay. Okay, so let's recap what we did. Right. We basically, I'm going to recap because I'm already forgotten what I did. So the first thing we did was, we can kind of tell what we did in terms of our thing. We created this environment file .env that had our development equals true in it. We went to our git ignore and we made sure we ignored it, right? We then went to our server TS and just used that environment variable to just do an extra console log. And then our package.json, we fixed it so that it could actually run this Heroku local command on local development, basically. Okay, so that takes care of our local development. But what about, when I try to run this push this up to the cloud? There's nothing in Heroku right now knows about this environment variable, so it won't actually do anything. So let me close this out. Okay, and we killed my local development now. Okay, so the command here is called Heroku config. So what this is going to do, this is going to actually inquire to my app in Heroku to see what environment variables are set. And you see there's none set. So I can either go to a GUI, which I will do real quick. If I go here, there is under settings, reveal config variables. This is where you can actually go in and set. You can type in key value pairs here. That's one way of setting it. Or you can do it from here. You can actually type in, let's make it this right, Heroku config set development equals true. And so what I'm doing is I'm telling Heroku, now if I type in Heroku config, it should say there's one environment variable called development true. And if I refresh the screen, I should see a single development variable development true. So now this means is when this code now, if I push this code up, it'll actually start logging every time I hit the API. It'll log out, I guess, the word world in this case, because of this environment set. If I delete the environment variable, it stops logging. Okay, so let's just push this up and validate everything here real quick. So git status, so I have a bunch of stuff, right? I have to commit it. No, I have to add it first. Then I have to commit it, environment. And then I have to do git push Heroku, right? In my case, I type in more core to master. Again, you're going to just do master more than likely. So this should then do my build process, right? The build pack, build the slug, generate a new release. Let's give this a second. Excuse me. Okay, we're almost there. Okay, so if I go to Roku, go to here, deployed a new version, and then if I say open app, it says hello world, which is not unexpected. Now the question is, how do I look at the logs? One way of doing it is viewing logs, and let's see, there's the world right here. Okay, so that's basically environment variables. There's a couple details around environment variables. I'll look at it here. So one is the combined sum of all of your environment variables have to be less than 32 kilobytes, which is, it's quite, it's a lot of characters, but there is a limit on it. You're not to start, in terms of how to, the values you type in here, that can be alphanumeric with underscores, okay? Okay, that's one. Two is by convention, you'll notice a lot of the examples and all the things that Heroku does are all in caps. So that's not required, but it is case sensitive, so be careful there. I've just had a habit used all caps then too, because Heroku uses all caps. You can't start with a double underscore. That's a reserved characters. Heroku uses it. And don't start it with the capital Heroku underscore. Again, that's Heroku reserved. Okay, so that's pretty much the entirety of environment variables. Another common, I used it for this development flag. One other some common use cases for environment variables are maybe credentials, right? You need to put in some sort of credentials for some third-party service, but you don't want to have it in your source code, right? So you can set it in your environment variables. Another one you can do is maybe you have different environments. You have a local development, you have a staging environment, and you have a production environment. And maybe you use different databases for each, so you can use an environment variable to set the database to use, right? And that can exist. The code's the same, but the environment variables are different in 3 instances, and so it'll use different databases. Okay, now I'm done with the topic of environment variables. So we just saw some logging. So let's go back to logging real quick and look at a couple things. First, we saw, so we're switching gears and we're talking about logging. So this is called the runtime log here, right? And in this log, let's see if I can see all the examples. I think I do see a lot of them. So one thing you'll notice here is there's different kinds of, they're kind of colored here, it makes it easy to see. So the one kind of logs you'll see in this runtime log will be logs from your apps, also called app logs. So the example there would be, here's one line right here, right? This is your code outputted the word world, and so this is an app log. Another one here, and in fact they even tell you right here, it's called app. Another one is here was this is again output by your code. It's when it actually started up. Okay. Another kind of log is called system logs, and here I think they call it Heroku logs. No, actually, yeah. So there's one here, and there's a couple up here, right? So let me make this bigger because it's kind of small. Okay. So for example, Heroku reported out here things like it started your app or stopped your app and restarted your app, right? And then more interesting are these router ones. These are still Heroku generated logs, right? But router in particular is, and we'll talk about this more later about what the router is, but basically the router is sitting on top of your application and routing traffic to your code, right? And there's some details around it. But it has its own logging, and it's sort of interesting in the sense that if you look at this right here, right, there's actually some details in here that are interesting. For example, this is saying basically the router got a request on the root. That was when we did the hello. We went to the web API and hit it, right? And see, there's a request ID. We'll talk about that later. This is what I'm really interested in is service. That's an interesting one. So this one says here is that the API took 14 milliseconds to run. So that was, hello world was pretty small, right? The status 304 is basically telling you what the response code it gave. In this case, the router actually detected that this was basically that nothing had changed essentially in the response. So instead of giving the actual data, it just gave a response code of 304, which is like, if I just do HTTP status codes, it'd be nice to remember what 304 exactly meant. It's basically saying nothing has changed. 304 is not modified, right? So that means basically it's unchanged essentially. If it had been a new API result, then it would have given a 200. Okay, so that's the second kind. So there's your app ones, Heroku generated ones. There's another one called an app log, and you can see right here. There's a couple up here. It says not app, API. It says API here. So what these are things that are related to, like when I pushed the code up, that triggered a new build, right? So this means the app is things that are being triggered, API calls into Heroku that are triggering something to happen. In this case, I was triggering a build by running the Heroku client locally. Okay, and there's a third one which you don't see right now, is as you start adding, we'll see this shortly, additional add-ons or resources, like third-party, like databases and whatnot, they have their own logs and they get pushed into the same common log. So, this thing can get quite busy as all these different systems are logging in here, right? So one of the things is this log, if you don't do anything special, this log is fairly limited. Heroku only retains the last 1,500 log entries, right? And then expires anything that's a week or older out. So, if you have a pretty active system, you're going to really have troubles finding log entries in here. So the key here is adding in something called a log drain. Now, which just basically allows these logs to exist here, but then instead of, it keeps a copy somewhere else, which maybe has a longer lifetime. And you can look at logs for the last a couple weeks instead of just last couple hours. Now, one of the before we go to that though, let's talk about one more thing. And there's another kind of logs. We've already kind of been seeing this. It's called the build logs. And the way you see that is under activity, or it's also summarized right here on the last. But what this is basically, this is telling you all the sort of things related to the build, right? Any changes that happened because the build happened. Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about, though, when we switch gears, is talk about resources. So we've not really looked at this resources tab very carefully, and it's related to logging. That's why I kind of put it next in this particular example. So what resources are? We saw this screen when we looked at the fact that we had a dyno running, right? But see all this blank add-on section? We don't have anything here. So what you can do is you can add on third-party tools to databases, whatever. And what we're going to look for here is called a log drain. Something that's going to take our logs and take them off of Heroku, store them somewhere else, and then maybe we can keep longer versions of it. So if I type in, I think I can just type it in here, Paper Trail, right? Paper Trail is a popular, and they have a free version. They also have, lots of versions here, depending on how much logging you need. I'm going to just use the free version here, and I'm going to provision it, and that adds a new entry in here, right? And a couple things. I'm going to show you one pattern about add-ons real quick. See this attached as Paper Trail? Let me just show you this before I look at Paper Trail itself. Go back to overview. settings, reveal config variables. So one of the things you'll notice here is it automatically added a entry in your config variables when I added that paper trail. So that's a common pattern for resources. A lot of times in order to use, let's say a database or something, some sort of add-on, you need maybe some credentials or you need something to interact with the resource you added in your code. And the way that Heroku does this is that they automatically populate your config variables with that value, right? Whatever it needs, like credentials or something. And that's how, and then of course, if you delete that resource, it'll automatically delete that entry out of here. So in this case, PaperTrail added an API token, which means that, now we're not going to use it, but from our code, we can use this token to directly interact with PaperTrail to add our own logging or configure things. We're not going to do that, but that's what this one, that's why this entry is here. Okay, let's go back to PaperTrail. So resources. So if I click on PaperTrail, it's going to bring up, first time it's going to give us some agreement, continue, and it's going to have no events, right? So now what I'm going to do is if I hit open app, right, and the question is, in theory, if I refresh here or something, I should see events. Now, one thing we're going to come back to this at the end of the video, but it turns out that PaperTrail just takes a few minutes to spin up, so it won't actually start logging. You won't see logs here for like another 5 minutes. So actually, what I'm going to do, better yet, instead of continuing, I'm going to pause the video and get a cup of coffee, and then come back and we'll make sure logging is working. So I'm going to pause the video for a second. Okay, we're back. It took about 5 minutes or so, and then I noticed that I just been waiting for this thing to start logging. So I just hit the refresh right on the API. Let me do it again. So right now that you see that there's one entry in here. There's a router, right, just like we saw before, and then we have our web API, which actually output the world log. So let me do another one of these, and go here, refresh. Oh, actually, not. I didn't have to even refresh it, by the way. Oops, I didn't actually have to refresh it. Let me do it one more time so we can see it. I got hasty. Yeah, see the extra entry now. Let me run it again, and a few seconds later, there is my next request right here. This is this is distracting here, but so I just basically saw another entry come in right here. So the idea is this thing automatically will update its logging. You can watch real time. It's kind of like a tail command, right? So that's basically it. The nice thing about this is it keeps a lot more logs, and you can start doing search, real-time searches on it right here. And there's all sorts of filtering features. In fact, I don't know all the features of PaperTrail, but I basically use, scrolling through the logs and then using the filtering here to look for, errors and whatnot. One other thing, we looked at logging. One thing we never actually did is run logs from the command line. You can actually get to Heroku Logs by typing in, I think it's Heroku Logs, and it'll show you the same sort of logs here, right? And another nice feature is you can do Heroku Logs with the flag called tail. And what that'll do is just show you the tail end of the logging. So just like this kind of does, if I were to just refresh this and see if I can do a split screen here. If I refresh this, you can see, I can see logging kind of real time here. Kind of handy for troubleshooting. Okay, so that's pretty much, I think, the entirety of logs. And in this case, recapping, we spent a lot of time talking about logging, but we also introduced this concept of resources, which is, let me close in all these other windows, I'm distracted. We added resources. In this case, we just add a logging resource, right? This is, later on going to add in databases and whatnot here, but that's what resources are about. So now one important thing before we cover the next topic is kind of revisiting releases. So let me do something here. So again, releases are basically new, so when we talked about releases last time is whenever we deploy new code, which was a new slug, that actually got bundled into something called a release, and our app got restarted with that release. Okay, and we're seeing releases fly by here. If you look on the right side here, you'll see the release here, right? So a couple things. Whenever you monkey around with resources, right, that actually generates a new release. Okay, so and then another thing that's important to know is every time you change an environment variable. So for example, if I was to go to settings, so right now I'm running on release 12, release 14 right now, right? Okay, let me just go in here. In fact, if you look carefully here, there was actually two releases happening when I added paper trail. Once because I added the actual resource, right? And then added a environment variable, and that triggered another release. So quite a bit of releases are happening just because when I added another resource. So if I was to go to settings here and just say reveal config variables, and if I just type in test true, hit add, and if I go back to overview, you'll notice that in the activity log, right, there was another build happened essentially, or not a build pack didn't run, but a new release got generated, right, which is a build-like activity. It basically says, oh, this test variable got set, and it just did a new release. And that's because environment variables adding or changing triggers releases, adding resources trigger releases, and then changing your slug triggers releases. Those are the main sources of releases. As a matter of fact, you can actually, if you look at the logs, which you can look at different ways, I guess I can look at paper trail. You notice that when that release came through, it actually restarted my app. So this right here, right? Basically that, that actually it's right here. See, set the environment variable test. It basically caused it to shut down all the processes and then start it all up, and there's my server running again. So it's important to know that releases are basically a combination of include your environment variables, resources, and your slug. Okay, that now I think we've talked about the kind of entirety of releases. So the next thing we're going to talk about is application metrics. So I don't want to forget this. I want to get rid of that config variable because I don't really need it. So delete it, and it's going to trigger basically a new release, right? So now I have a new release saying that removed the test. Now I have a new release 16. Okay, next topic, metrics. So if you go to metrics, you notice that it says because I'm not using the right, I'm not paying basically for my dynos, right? I have to pay something before I get metrics. So I'm going to turn this on. Again, everything is all prorated per hour, or actually per second. So it doesn't cost me too much to switch this. So I will pay the price to demo. So if I hit change dyno type, it says hobby. I'm going to change it to actually one of these here. Hobby gives you metrics, but I want to talk about alerting, and you have to go all the way up to the standard before you can do alerting. So I'm going to turn on this one. So now I'm paying $25 a month. For the hour I do, it may cost me all of like 5 cents or something like that. Let me go into metrics now. So now that I'm using the right kind of dyno, I'm actually starting to see some logging here, right? So let's look at the logs. Now this is kind of a silly example where I've got one API that I don't use a whole bunch, so the data doesn't look a little bit weird here because there's just not enough data to make it sensible, but let's see if we can go through it. So I'm going to break down sort of these different sections of the logging. So the first one is events. So this is just basically describing some at the Heroku level, some important events in your application. So things, in this case, I've been doing a lot of deployments, right? So that's what all this activity here is. I'm basically doing a lot of deployments, and I'm getting a lot of restarts because of it, and config changes. So that's what all these blue activities are. Now, important here will be look out for are things like, especially these critical red blocks that can show up here. And what those are events, that, some sort of event that Heroku is caught and it's reporting that, that's something that it thinks you need to pay attention to, right? And in particular, what are those sort of events? So if you type in, let's Google this, Heroku event error codes. I think it's error codes, right? So if you look up Heroku error codes, there's a lot of them. One, and you see there's all these H's, L's, right? So one, I don't know all of them, right? But what you'll start to see in your event log, you may see these red blocks, and if you hover over them, it'll say, hey, H12 or H13 or whatever it is, right? And so that will tell you, oh, something's going wrong. So if you click on, for example, the one that I've seen before is called Proquest Timeout. I'll just illustrate it. So if one of the things that your web app has to do, it has to respond. If an API request comes in, you have 30 seconds to write your first byte back to the output. And if you don't do it within 30 seconds, the router will say, I assume this is dead, and it'll kill off your connection and for that client and send back an error code, right? Like response code 500. But it also will log an H12 event, which basically says it basically killed your app because your request too long. And that would show up as a little red block back in this chart. Okay, so that's what the Heroku events are. It's pretty much things that it did, Heroku did on your behalf, and some of them can be critical errors. Okay, scroll down. Memory usage is pretty much what it is. Your dyno is running, right? And it has, I believe, the lowest tier dynos have 512 megabytes of RAM, right? And right now you can see that I'm only been running, right now since I started this thing, I've only been running about 16 megs of RAM. That's kind of the, I got a hello world basically running. So that's pretty much, and then, so I have a lot of headroom here. Just as a reminder, on these tiers, when you're not running in private spaces but running under the common runtime, it basically allow you up to double the amount of RAM. So in this case, up to a gigabyte. If it exceeds double, it's going to basically restart your app, and then, but it'll log memory warnings or memory errors in your events above, which is one of these error codes. And I'm not sure where it is, but there's a memory error here. I can't find it fast enough, but there's a memory error one. Okay, response time is the next sort of metric that they keep track of. It's pretty important metric, and this is basically reporting sort of essentially how fast your server is responding to responses. And at first, it's not entirely clear how to understand this here. So let me try to see if I can explain it. Max is pretty easy to understand. This is basically, in this last interval, it says the maximum, you can see it's right here at 8 milliseconds. So the longest in that window, which is, I'm running this is logging every 24 hours. So I forget, this is probably a 5-minute interval right here, or 10-minute interval. The longest it took to respond to any request in that window was 8 milliseconds. Okay, that's what this one here is, right? These other ones basically mean, if it says 99 percentile, that means 99% of the responses were 8 milliseconds or faster, meaning less time. 95 percentile means 95% of the activity took 8 milliseconds or less. And then the 50 percentile basically means half of them, 50% of the requests were this much or faster. So there must have been one really fast request in here, right? Again, these numbers are kind of weird because I have such low activity, but the idea here is this gives you a sense of, you can look at this graph and quickly see where most of your, you may have some outliers, some API requests that took longer for some reason, but this will give you a sense of, like at 95 percentile, you say, hey, most of them are this fast or faster, right? So that's what response time is. Throughput is, this is basically measuring how, oh, right. This actually took me a minute to remember what this RPS was. This basically is requests per second. So this tells you in this interval, right, how many basically how many requests per second were you able to handle, right? Now the problem is right now, I have no load on this thing, so this thing is like off the charts, like basically zeroed out, right? Because I haven't really been moving a lot of traffic. So this will start going up, and this is again tells you how fast your servers be able to process requests. Okay, and then the next one is called load, and this is basically kind of describing um, how much how much your CPU is being loaded by your server, right? So one is memory, right? And then basically how much CPU is kind of another big constraint you have. And again, right now I'm basically not using it, so I'm not seeing a lot of activity here. But the units here go from 0 to 1. And if you need to Google this, just look up Unix load, just type in Unix load metric. This is basically Unix load metric, and I think see if I get it right. Basically, it's describing how over that window, on average, how many processes are waiting around to be processed, right? So the idea is your processors, you have a single processor doing stuff, and if it's busy, other like things that need to happen may have to wait for it. And if that happens, then it counts as a process is waiting. So that's it's a very standard way when in the Unix environment to measure your load over a certain period of time. So if you're at basically 0, it means nothing has been waiting. At the other extreme basically means over the length of that interval, if you have a 1, that basically means there has been a process waiting around to be processed all the time. So this means that your CPU is basically maxed out. It's busy all the time, and there's always things waiting for you. Okay, so that's basically load. Okay, so bad at the top, good at the bottom, basically. The next thing is that's it for this sort of metrics, right? Now, obviously, one thing you can look at this graph to see metrics, but you might want to know proactively when there are problems. So that's where alerting comes into play. And there's only two kinds of alerting. One is response time threshold. This is the, um, this again was how many milliseconds did it take for that API to respond, right? And you can see that they're saying 95% is not configurable, right? It's always at 95%. They're saying basically, hey, this is the threat. They don't want to have you get emailed every time one API call kind of runs longer, right? But they're basically saying if 95% of your API calls are this or lower, right, then it's cool. But if 95 if it goes over this amount, right, then maybe you should know about it. So in this case, it says if the 95 percentile metric for threshold for response time exceeds 1 second, then maybe this is going to be a problem. So this is like the trigger. Now you can actually sensitivity means how sensitive do you want this to be. 1 minute means, hey, if this basically happens over 1 minute, tell me about it, and you can then configure it down to. So this, if you change it to 10, it means that, hey, this has to happen over the course of 10 minutes before I need to worry about it. And this basically lets you then set up your email addresses to send and do reminders and whatnot. Okay, and then another one here basically is looking for, right, the other one was monitor failed requests. These are basically looking for errors, right? And then if, this basically, if the percentage of requests failing, then this is like at 5%, right? So this is at 5% of my requests are failing, let me know about it, right? So this is another sort of metric. One's response time and one's just looking for failed requests, and then you could be emailed with those too. Okay, so that's basically alerting. If you read the docs about this, they make a suggestion. Let's look at this. Heroku alerting, alerts. They have a section on alerts here. Right, this is basically the section. One of the things interesting enough they mention a third-party service called PagerDuty, which is a third-party tool for managing. If I click on it, it's a third-party tool for managing like these kind of alert messages, and they basically recommend this solution, partially because one of the things that they don't want you doing with this tool, it's kind of buried in here, is that when you're in here and you're managing these email addresses in here, right? They don't really want you to do a lot of activity here. They want you to really just set up, they don't want you basically just defining a giant distribution group in this tool here and then managing your distribution group out of this list. What they really want you to do is send your messages to something like PagerDuty, where then you manage your group of, maybe you've got 10 engineers and you're rotating people and whatnot. They actually have some limits around how many email addresses you can monkey with here to basically prevent you from using this essentially as your page, equivalent to PagerDuty. So they're recommending you use a third-party service to manage your actual group of humans that are being monitoring these alerts. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. I believe that is the end of this section. So let me stop the video. And there's another video coming. I'm not sure even the topic yet, but we'll get there when we get there.